Welcome back to The Healing Habit, where we talk about the importance of healing and how to make it a part of your everyday life. I'm your host, Cassie.
And my name is Renatha Lollis.
And today, Renatha, I think we're going to be talking about some viewer feedback, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so let's just hop right into it because
Yeah.
I know we've had a couple different questions here and there. Um, Number one, it kind of seems like forgiveness and understanding where to like cut people off. It's like a spectrum in terms of how far you need to go to protect yourself, if that makes
Yeah.
sense. So I guess our first question is kind of just how do you know when you should cut someone off versus I just need to forgive that person and let them continue to stay in my life, but maybe keep them on the outer circle. It feels like it's a spectrum. So can
Yeah.
we dive a little bit into that? Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think, one of the things that's interesting for most of us is that as we're sort of walking through relationships, there is this nuance, right? Every single person is going to be different. Every relationship is going to be different. And as we're discussing this idea of healing, healing in relationship is a huge thing,
Yeah.
right? Because most of the hurt that we experience will happen in relationship.
Mhm.
And if we're thinking about forgiveness and the importance of forgiveness and sort of as that entry point to healing, then how to navigate these relationships becomes a really, really important thing.
Yeah.
And it is, I think from the previous two episodes that we have done, there's been a little bit of confusion about where to land. Like, is this the path to reconciliation? And if I'm always open to reconciliation, am I actually a doormat?
Mhm.
Or should I make the decision to cut somebody out of my life and then create no path towards restoration of that relationship? And trying to navigate what that looks like is going to be very different for every relationship. So
Right.
I want to kind of give a little bit of context. And here's the thing. Because this is what I do, sometimes I can get into the weeds, Cassie. So I am going to trust that you will bring me out of the weeds if I get too far into this, because I want to make this as understandable as I possibly can for anybody who's listening to this, wherever they are on their journey to healing, so that they can get some benefit from it. So is that fair? Can you make sure I don't go into the weeds?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely. That is my role here.
Okay,
I'm
awesome.
I'm here for the people who don't understand.
Well, again, because it can feel like a really complex topic,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So let's talk about forgiveness as a spectrum of how it is expressed.
Mm.
Okay. So there is a school of thought that if you forgive someone, that means that that person now has free access back into your life.
Mm.
And that is the answer to that, or the response to that, is it depends, right? So I want to go first to the full extreme.
Okay.
And so let's talk about those scenarios where it is absolutely unsafe for you to be in a relationship with someone. Okay.
Mhm.
So if we're talking about physical danger, where this person is threatening you, has threatened you, has actually harmed you in a way that is physical, where you are currently in fear for your life, then these are situations where allowing that person to have access is going to be very, very dangerous. And so, what I would say to any person who is in that situation is that they need to seek assistance immediately to make sure that they are physically safe. And that is a very, very important thing. So, I can forgive you no matter what the wrong was that was committed against me, whatever that is. I have the capacity to forgive you. But my ability to maintain relationship with you is going to depend on several factors. Now, when we think about the absolute other end of the spectrum, where someone may have said a harsh statement to you,
Mhm.
or may have spoken to you in a very curt tone and been unkind with their words. So now, was there hurt and injury? Yes, but it is on the lowest possible level. But when we're talking about the highest level, physical harm to you or those who you have been in relationship with, these are two very different ends of the spectrum, which is going to cause you to experience two different types of manifestations of this forgiveness. So, we talked about in the previous episode that forgiveness is going to be something that happens internally, but then you experience it externally and how you connect with people, right?
Right.
So if I make the decision to release you from the debt. I am saying that I am no longer holding on to this offense. And we are at the highest end of the spectrum. I then have to make the decision whether or not physical proximity to you is going to put me into further danger. Right?
Right.
Now, many people struggle with being able to determine exactly, what that next step is going to be. And we've talked about this before, and this is a really important point. Don't try to make this decision on your own. Invite.
That's really good.
Absolutely.
That's
You
really
want to
good.
be able to bring people into this conversation with you
Yeah.
so that you're able to share your perspective and to get wise counsel. Right? Because when we're looking at a situation, if you and I are experiencing the exact same thing, we're going to respond to it from each of our individual perspectives. You're going to see it one way, and I'm going to see it another way. And when I am focused only on my way of seeing things, then my ability to see it from anybody else's perspective is going to be very, very limited.
Right.
But when I'm thinking about making the decision to remove somebody from my life forever, then it is important for me to bring other people into this conversation to make sure that I am seeing it properly.
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, and also there's something to consider too of like, maybe it's not forever. Maybe it's just you're removing them from your life for a season. Like, can we talk a little bit about that? How do you know the difference between that person can never enter into my life again and that person needs to not be in my life right now, but maybe at a later date they can come back in?
Yes, and I think that's a really good distinction.
Yeah.
So in thinking about this in terms of never, I'm very, very wary of using the word never. And the reason why I'm wary about that word is that it removes the ability for change and transformation to happen in someone's life.
Right.
Because when I say that I will never communicate with you again, then that means that I am closing the door for any level of connection to ever happen again. Now, let's clarify this. If we're talking about someone who was a victim of a crime, and they had been harmed by a person, there was never any relationship to begin with the perpetrator. So there is never an expectation for you and that person to move back into relationship because one never existed before. So it is reasonable and wise for you to forgive that person and to never give them access to your life again because there was never any relationship. But now let's talk about this in terms of a family relationship, a parent, if you will, where there has been behavior that you, as the person who has received this negative experience, that you say, I don't know that I want to allow that person to have access now because I was hurt so badly. When we make the decision to end that family connection forever, what we're saying in that moment is that there is no possibility for that person to change or to be different. We're not creating any space for growth to happen. So as we're looking at this, we can absolutely in that moment choose to set a boundary. Now, we've talked about boundaries just a little bit, and I think that there are some misconceptions about what boundaries actually are.
Right.
Because right now in culture, what we're finding is that people are cutting folks out of their lives and stating that, I'm setting a firm boundary. When in fact, that's actually not a boundary at all, because a boundary is something that we put in place that determines how we're going to relate to one another.
Right.
I am saying that this is how I expect to be treated in this relationship. A boundary is a healthy thing, and I think it's very, very important. But it also, if we're not careful, can be used as a tool to simply avoid conflict rather than manage it.
Right.
And we have to learn how to have conversations and accept the fact that we're not always going to agree. So as we're talking about that spectrum of being able to say, I'm cutting this person off forever, or I'm going to set a boundary, and until you learn how to communicate with me in a way that is respectful and honorable, then we won't be able to have relationship. So I can choose to remove myself from a situation for a period of time and then seek to reestablish with firm boundaries in place so that everybody understands how to connect with one another.
Yeah, I think that that's really interesting too. When you think about, there's just, I would say, an epidemic of people pleasing in the world where you don't want anybody to not like you, and you might put up with way more than you should because sometimes people feel like it's their only option.
Yeah.
It could be a friendship where maybe you don't have a lot of friends and you're like, well, or even a relationship in that sense where you're just like, I crave feeling loved. And so you will tolerate a lot more than you probably should.
Yeah. Those boundaries are going to be really based on the individual. So, regardless of where someone shows up in my life, there is, for me, a boundary about respectful and honoring communication. So, whether it is the people who are in that inner circle, who are friends, who are associates, and who are just mere acquaintances, I have a personal boundary of what communication should look like for me, no matter who you are. And so, one of the things that we can find ourselves doing in this sort of people pleasing world is that we open ourselves up to lots of different offense in the desire to be able to your point, maintain those relationships. And that's a really, really important point because we don't want to be isolated. You've invested time in these relationships. They have value to you. So you don't want to just discard it and throw it away. But the challenge is that our cup gets more and more full over time, and it rises the more we people please and we don't feel like it is being reciprocated. The more we give and it doesn't seem to be honored, the more we love and that person doesn't respond in kind, it gets higher and higher and higher and higher until all of a sudden we explode and we decide we don't want to have any relationship because now I have given so much and not received what I expected in return. Yeah. And this is the very definition of that sort of walking away in estrangement, where you feel that I have given so much that my only recourse is to walk away. When in reality, this is where we have to learn how to manage the conflict. Right. Because what we tend to do is as people pleasers, and I am a recovered people pleaser. I'm number 7 of 8 children. And the only way you survive in a house with 7 older siblings is that you learn a little bit of people pleasing to be able to get by.
I need that as a t-shirt, recovered people pleaser.
but it's very true. Yeah. And so, but in this, because I just wanted everyone to love me and I just wanted everyone to be happy. And you can find yourself falling into this trap of behavior where you're seeking all of this external validation. And then when it isn't returned, there's this frustration and there is this sense of rejection and abandonment that can happen, which then causes you, the injured party, to feel as if you're justified in cutting them off because they didn't respond in the way that you responded. When in reality, I was responsible for setting healthy boundaries and expectations.
Right.
And because I didn't manage those relationships well, I gave in a way that was unhealthy. I self-abandoned and I put an expectation on others to know how to treat me.
Right.
And so that led to some fragility in me. I was very, very fragile emotionally because I'm giving and I'm giving and I'm giving all the time. And I didn't have the ability to accept when things constantly went in a different direction because of my own expectations. And when we are fragile in our response, and by fragility, I mean where we are brittle, where we're easily broken, we're easily hurt, we're easily damaged. When we don't understand how to manage conflict well, we become very fragile. Right. And we then seek to avoid conflict. And as we avoid conflict, we label people as toxic or abusive or unhealthy, and we then cut them out of our lives as if, just as we have changed and grown, they don't have the capacity to change and grow.
Wow.
So as we learn how to manage conflict well, as we seek to become more forgiving people, one of the benefits of this is that we become resilient, right? We become stronger. Our ability to bounce back becomes greater. So when we have these situations where we are seeking relationship, but we have the strength in that moment to be able to express our boundaries and to be able to then hold people accountable to treat us in a way that we desire to be treated and manage conflict so those relationships can be stronger and be deeper. Does that make sense?
So for somebody who has a track record of not being able to respect the boundaries, not really even showing interest in you as a person, and you're like, I don't really necessarily want to be treated that way, but this person's in my life. Yes. Like, I am not going to quit my job over this person, but man, they make me uncomfortable. And maybe even they think that you guys are a lot closer than you are, which makes things additionally challenging, especially for recovered people pleasers, you know, because we're like, well, I don't, it's hard. It's like finding a hard balance because you're not going to cut them out entirely. But at the same time, you need to get to a point where you're not putting that expectation on them to be the friend that you know that right now they're not capable of being. And so I just want to know like what you recommend to do in terms of like maybe the boundary needs to be within myself, you know, that person who is continuing to push that boundary or maybe not meet those expectations, I need to adjust the way I look at that person. You know what I mean?
Exactly right, Cassie. Because we have control over our expectations.
Right.
I get to set what I expect in life. And if I expect you to respond in a way and you're never meeting the expectation, I'm constantly injuring myself because I've given you an expectation that you don't have the capacity to meet. So by being able to set an internal boundary of saying, this is what I'm willing to do, and if this person doesn't meet that, then I will just vote with my feet and walk away, and not walk away as in erase the relationship, but I limit their access. I then limit the amount of time that I spend in communication with them. And here's the other thing, and this is something that we've lost in our very digital, disconnected society. Have a conversation.
Ugh.
Sit down
Which
across.
that's the hard thing to do. And everybody's like, oh, I'd rather just cut them out because it's easier in a sense.
Exactly right. It feels easier. But when we were talking about this previously, about the impact of unforgiveness, what we're not paying attention to is what this does to our nervous system. Right? That as we're walking around with all of these severed relationships, all of these unresolved emotions, this anger and this unforgiveness, it is the very opposite of healing. Because just because someone is not in my life doesn't mean that I'm still not being emotionally impacted by them.
Yes.
They are living rent-free in your head every single day, or every time you're triggered by a memory or an experience. When if we could just sit across from a person and say, hey, I'm having an experience with you that I would really like to talk about. And I hope, are you open for us maybe to talk just a few minutes so I can tell you what's going on?
And I feel like the hard part about that too is going into that conversation without the expectation that they're going to understand and walk away like, wow, that was a life-changing conversation and I need to change so much. Like, there's a couple options that one option would be that they take what you have to say and they're like, yeah, I'll definitely work on that. And then they don't. And then another potential is that they just reject everything that you say. And that's really hard because like, I think if I'm understanding correctly, we have to go into those conversations more for closure for ourselves and not for them. Like that conversation is for our own healing and not for them.
Exactly right. Because here's what makes those conversations so very difficult is that we have an expected outcome in our mind. We told ourselves a story about how this is supposed to go. And then because of that story we've told ourselves, we now create an expectation because we decided that we were going to be a fortune teller and decide exactly what the outcome was going to be when we don't know. So in any situation, the only person you can control is yourself.
Right.
You can't control how someone's going to receive what you're saying. So now you set the expectation not on their behavior, not on their response, but on what you desire to communicate and how you desire to communicate it.
Right.
So let's talk about that coworker. Let's use that as an example. And this is a really prevalent one. I worked in corporate America in human resources for many, many years and coached people on how to have really difficult conversations. So as I'm sitting across from a coworker and I'm attempting to try and find a way for us to be able to communicate well in the workplace, what I'm going to say to them is I'm going to ask them first, hey, do you have maybe 5 or 10 minutes so we can talk about a few things I think is going to help us be better at communicating? And when we start any conversation, start with your internal goal in mind. What do you want to accomplish? And sometimes that is, I simply want to be heard. I simply want to share my heart in a way that hopefully they will be able to hear. I want to be able to communicate to them what I'm feeling. The next thing we have to make sure we're doing when we're having these conversations is not to start with accusations. Things like you always, you never. Those are ways in which we're accusing people of behavior. But what we want to do is make this be about how they made you feel. When we are working on this, I feel as if I'm not being heard, or it feels as if you are not valuing my opinion. And you make this about who you are and what you feel versus making an accusation about who that person is and what they always do. Right. So talking about how you feel allows you in that moment to have some agency because you're talking about you. Right. And it also gives that person the opportunity to clarify. Because just because we feel that something is happening doesn't mean it's actually happening. Right. So if I feel as if I'm not being valued and I say that to you, it gives you the space to say, no, I absolutely value you. And if there's something that I'm doing to make you feel that way, I apologize. Right. Because in that moment, it creates an opportunity for us to have a dialogue. Right. But if I make the statement, that person never values me, I've made an accusation, and now I've successfully closed the door of communication because I've accused you of doing something that you may not actually be doing.
Right. And as you say that, I was thinking of something my dad always used to say to me, which is trust equals behavior over time. He would always say that, like growing up, trust equals behavior over time. I was thinking about how somebody might be on an outer circle, but that they could jump to an inner circle over time with gaining your trust, right? So I know a lot of people that it's like you hurt them once, you're on the outer circle right away. They don't trust you at all. Yeah. Is that a healthy thing?
Well, so most of the time when that happens, it really isn't about you. Right. It's about a previous wounding.
Right. That's what I was thinking. So there's not closure or forgiveness in that one area.
But understand that when a person makes the decision to cut someone out of their life immediately like that, it is typically because they've had some previous wounding. And what they're responding to is what has happened in the past. And they're attempting to make sure that they can protect themselves from being hurt like that again in the future. Right? So it is about that previous wounding. And here's the other challenge. We live in a world today where we have access to more mental health information and mental health knowledge than we ever have before. So we have stepped into a place where language like triggers and, being able to call things healthy or unhealthy or toxic versus non-toxic, they are standard parts of our language. And what I would encourage all of us to do is when we're having these conversations, refrain from diagnosing someone, right? Right. Being able to say how I made you feel without making a judgment about the other person gives you the ability to speak about your heart, your emotions, and at the same time allows the other person the ability to respond based on what their experience has been.
So one question I do have here in this conversation, let's say you're meeting with that coworker and you're having that conversation and your goal is I just want to be heard. Yeah. Because I mean, like we were saying, there's not really much that you can do to fix them. That has to be their decision. Yes. Their healing journey or their healing habits are their responsibility. And I think that that's something that people need to grasp onto a little bit more because we walk around with this I can fix them mentality and we carry that into relationships and friendships. And it's like it's almost like we have like a God complex in a sense where we think that we can be the one who's in charge of their healing or if we just had this conversation with them, they'll change. And that I know what they need. Let me prescribe them. You just need to sit and journal and really sit with your thoughts for a little bit, yes. and it doesn't work like that. I think that's where we keep re-injuring ourselves because we walk into these conversations with the expectation that the other person is going to heal when we should be walking into the conversations with our own expectation to heal.
Gold star, Cassie. Yes, that's it. Gold star.
I'm changing.
That's it. So each of these conversations, we have to take our own sense of responsibility. Right. So when we're sitting in these conversations, if we're starting them out saying, my goal for this conversation is for us to be able to communicate better when we're done. I'm taking responsibility in that moment and I'm setting the tone. I'm not making an accusation, but I start with an inward decision to be able to be better myself, and with the internal goal of making my healing important.
Wow.
Right? And having these conversations in a way that is healthy, that is honoring, that simply leads to me being heard and communicating in a way where I am hearing and honoring the other person. So yes, that is the goal.
Yeah.
And we have to get back to being able to have conversations.
Yeah.
And having them in a way that we can seek to hear and be heard.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, when we get back to our humanity, that place where we want the human connection, and it will begin to change everything. And I want to say this, it's also important that we not attempt to have these conversations via text.
Oh,
because that is what we try to do, right? Because
we hide behind the phone.
We do. We hide
Yeah.
behind the phone, and we use, emojis and bold and, and all caps
lock. Yeah.
to be able to express all of this language and all of these emotions, when if we could just have some human interaction.
Right.
Just have that connection and seek to connect heart to heart on those relationships that are in the inner circle, or those family members, or those people who we've invested time with. If we can begin the process of simply being willing to hear each other, that'll open up the door for healing to enter into these relationships, and that everyone can walk away more healthy than they ever were before.
Renatha, you said something that was so powerful just now. You were saying that we need to be able to hear each other. And I love that thought, because I think there are a lot of people that are going to be listening to this episode that know that the conversation needs to be had, but are struggling to build up the courage. A lot of us are emotionally unhealthy or lack emotional maturity in some capacity, and maybe we're aware of that and we're working on it. And we know that having these types of conversations is where we start, but there's a fear of emotional vulnerability, right? And especially with somebody who's hurt you, to go and tell them, hey, your behaviors are hurting me. They've been hurting me. I need this to change. Or even just expressing so that you're heard, right? Like I was saying, there's some fear of vulnerability in that. So what would you say to those people that are preparing for a conversation like that? How do they gain the confidence?
I love that question, because most of us, if we're honest, probably have a person in our life who, and we spend time with, who in some way can rub us the wrong way. Like most of us have that relationship, and we become experts at navigating that relationship, right? Of not telling that one friend who can be a little judgmental, you don't share information with her, or withholding this information from your mom because she's going to have a response, or telling your husband only about this thing you did and not telling him about that thing because he may have a response. So we become experts at sort of navigating these relationships and only partially sharing. And because, to your point, there's this fear of vulnerability, there's this fear of rejection or anger or any number of things that we can be afraid of. What I would say is that if you're beginning with that conversation, the first thing that you have to determine is, what is your intention? What do you want to have happen in this conversation for your benefit? Again, it's not about their behavior. It is about your benefit. Right. So if you are trying to work up the courage to have this conversation, it is also being able to do it in a way, in a setting that is going to give you the greatest amount of confidence. What I'm going to say to you is, if you're going to have that conversation, don't do it in between running errands, right? Don't do it when you don't have time to properly address it, but to be able to create space and time to be able to have that conversation. Also, here's the truth. Sometimes you have to do it scared. I would love to tell you that we can prepare someone to where they are absolutely confident with no fear 100% of the time. And that's just not the case. Because sometimes a little bit of anxiety or fear still may be in your heart when you start having the conversation. But what I would encourage people to do is to begin with the end in mind. Who will you be on the other side of this conversation?
Wow.
How better could the relationship possibly be if you have the courage to have the conversation? Because here's what we believe. We believe that courage is the absence of fear. It is absolutely not. Courage is the fear being present, but you being able to have the fortitude and the resilience to push through the fear, to knowing that you can keep your eyes to the other side of this hard thing and focus on what could potentially come out of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I was hearing somebody speak about like anxiety one time and how we can dream up these crazy, crazy scenarios that have us like, you know, just in a really, really horrible situation. And in our minds, we believe that and we put all of our energy into believing that. And this person was saying, what if instead of that, we put all of our energy into believing for the best?
Yes.
And I think that that's something that is really scary, because to be an optimist is to become vulnerable, because what if that thing doesn't happen?
Yes.
And what if it does actually end up, it's just like the what ifs, you know?
Yeah.
What if it does end up where that person never talks to me again? And I think in that we have to just kind of be like, what if, you know?
Yes.
At least you put your best foot forward and you gave it everything you had. And if that relationship ends, it's because, or I would say if that relationship ends, it's not for your lack of effort.
Yes.
You know, like it's not going to go down because you didn't give it everything you had.
Exactly.
So I want to be cautious of our time here. Really quickly, can we just touch up on when should a relationship be reconciled? I want to make sure we answer that question before we run out of time.
Yes.
Yes.
So let's think about this in terms of the value of that relationship on your life.
Right.
I mentioned before that if this was a situation where this is a person who you had no previous relationship with, where there had been no investment of time and no connectivity, that relationship, there's nothing there to build on. But when we're talking about a relationship that you have invested time, that you have emotional connection with, that this is a foundational relationship with you, it is very important that before you make the decision to throw that relationship away, that you are sure and very sure that the possibility of transformation doesn't exist.
Right.
Now, here's what I will say. When we're looking at the spectrum of offense, because offense does have a spectrum. We're talking about somebody who cut you off in traffic and someone who murdered a relative. We're
Right.
talking about an extreme spectrum of offenses that can happen in the life of a person. And when we're looking at this spectrum, we have to then, as we make the decision to become a more healthy person and in doing that become more forgiving, we're considering reconciliation based on the amount of investment of time that has been in this relationship. So if you have, and I have an example of someone I know personally who had an abusive parent, and that parent had been abusive to them, and they had grown up in a very abusive household as a child. And but she came from a culture that said that you have to maintain relationship no matter what. But as she grew and she noticed how unhealthy the relationship was, what she came to understand was that the way the relationship currently existed no longer honored her and it no longer served her. So she had to make a decision about what continuing on in the relationship with this abusive parent would be like. Well, as she was working through that thought process and trying to figure out how to do this, she did what I mentioned earlier. She sought wise counsel and she talked to people about how do I maintain this relationship, or if I should even maintain this relationship. Should I just separate because this person doesn't seem to be changing? But the decision she made was one that I thought was really, really interesting. She chose to institute healthy boundaries with this abusive parent. She actually had a conversation with her parents and she expressed how her childhood made her feel. And she was able to share her frustration about some of the things that happened. And in that sharing, I would love to say that we had a beautiful hallmark moment and that my friend's life was transformed after that conversation because everybody heard it and they changed, but they didn't. It was actually a very, very tense conversation where she was able to get it out, but she was not heard.
Wow.
She didn't have the ability to share.
Yes.
And what she shared in that conversation was really, really important. What she explained to them was because that some of those behaviors were still happening, that she was making the decision that in order for her to maintain relationship, these would be the things that she would be willing to accept. And if unhealthy language began to happen, then she would no longer stay around. if a language or if there was behavior that didn't align with how she believed she needed to be treated, that she would leave. And she began this process of instituting boundaries. And it was very inconvenient for her. There were times where they would have a family gathering and some of those unhealthy patterns would start, and she would have to leave and say, I'm sorry, I told you guys I'm no longer participating in this. And she would leave. But an interesting thing happened. As she continued to maintain her boundaries, everyone around her began to change.
Wow.
They began to treat her with the respect that she demanded, not with anger, not with outbursts, but with boundaries. And when they knew that there was a behavior that she didn't approve of, whether it was foul language or accusations or fighting in anger, when she was around, they would curb that behavior because they knew that she would respond with her boundary and leave. And it became freeing for her because she exercised her power and her agency, but it also became very instructive to her family because her family members had an opportunity to see that shift and that change as well. And as a unit, because she modeled healthy behavior, everything began to change.
Wow.
So relationships don't have to be cut off. Reconciliation is a process that can happen if there has been investment in that relationship and you want to manage it. Because I will say this, and this is true, you can be in a healthy relationship with an unhealthy person.
Right.
You have to choose to be the healthy person and hold appropriate boundaries so that that relationship can be what it needs to be in this season, with that person being who they currently are.
That is exactly what I wanted to hear, because I think that we often are like idealizing or fantasizing about who that person could be. And we'll even get into relationships with somebody as like a fixer-upper relationship, where it's like,
Absolutely.
Oh, but they could be, or well, I knew them to be. Maybe a version of them in the past was somebody who was kinder and nicer, but they went through some things and they changed in the negative. And I think what you just said is so true. We have to be able to take that conversation like we're talking to them as who they are right now. And 6 months down the road, if they stay exactly the same, what's going to change in us? And I think too, as like kind of a perfect way to tie this all up with a bow, just to think about how we're thinking about those people's unhealthy behaviors. Oftentimes we will catch ourselves saying, well, they always do this, or even not to them, not the assumptive conversations, but just internally we're like, well, there they go again. I've seen them do this before. And so we'll tell ourselves, oh, I've forgiven them. But then the second that they do that same pattern, we jump right back into, I knew they were going to do that. Yeah. And I think that holds them in that prison as well of like, well, if I'm treating them like they're never going to change, then they're definitely never going to change. And there's a point where we have to take that into our own responsibility and look at ourselves in the mirror and not be like, oh, everything that they're doing is my fault. We shouldn't do that. But instead to be like, well, what can I change about how I interact with them so that I know that there's at least a potential for this to move in a positive direction. And a lot of that is letting go.
Yes.
And I think that in the name of the podcast, being the healing habit, this is a daily choice.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's a really important point, that we're making a decision every day to live in a way that we are going to take responsibility for how we show up in the world.
Right.
And not place a demand on people to be anything other than what they are.
Right. Absolutely. Well, this was just a fantastic conversation. And thank you all for listening to episode 4 of The Healing Habit. Again, I'm your host, Cassie.
And I'm Renatha Lollis.
And Renatha, what are we going to be speaking about on our next episode?
Well, our next episode, I'm actually going to be introducing a forgiveness model. We've talked about forgiveness as a healing habit, but I want to talk about the different steps of forgiveness so people can know how to actually engage with forgiveness.
Oh, That I'm excited for that one. Well, thank you so much again for listening to episode 4 of The Healing Habit. And if you want to take your healing habits one step further, we do have links in the description down below where you can just have access to professional help that can take all of that just one step further. Um, but yeah, thank you guys so much for listening, and we will see you guys all on the next episode of The Healing Habit.